Our reading is going to be from the book of Exodus. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That is why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. There the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test. He said, "If you listen carefully to the Lord, your God, and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. On the 5th day of the 2nd month after they had come out of Egypt, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day, they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he heard your grumbling against him." "Who are we that you should grumble against us?" Moses also said. "You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard you grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses told Aaron, "Say to the entire Israelite community, 'Come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling.'" While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked towards the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. The Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." That evening quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It's the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent." The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little. And when they did, they measured it by the omer. The one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone had gathered as much as they needed.
Don't you hate it when people moan and they go on and on? It's really awful, isn't it? And if you've just agreed with me, what have we just all done together? We've just joined in a moan, haven't we? That I started, and you went, oh yeah, that's right, it's awful. We've had a good old moan together about moaning. We do it because it makes us feel better. Rather than bottling up what we're feeling, we let it out, and it feels good. Particularly if there's a sympathetic audience who kind of agree with us and kind of join in with us. Have you ever realised, though, that moaning and grumbling are spiritual issues? They affect our relationship with God as individuals and as a community. Perhaps you noticed it as Feruz was reading to us. It's mentioned in verse 24 of chapter 15. It's that the people grumbled. It's several times at the start of chapter 16. It talks about them grumbling. By chapter 17, they're said to be quarrelling with Moses and testing God. And these are people, these Israelites, they've just experienced the stupendous power of God that we reference in our first song, splitting the sea, quite literally, so they could walk right through it and escape from the slavery in Egypt that they had experienced for generations to begin their journey to the promised lands that God was leading them to. The rest of chapter 15 up until this point is a song of explosive praise for God's deliverance to them. They set off on their journey with optimism and with joy, but a little bit like children going on a long journey on their way to a holiday. They set out excited, but it doesn't take them long before they're arguing and quarrelling. How long did it take the Israelites to start? Did you spot that? If you look down to verse 22, the first verse that Ferry's read, 3 days until they start grumbling. Now, in their defence, there's a small nation's worth of people, 600,000 men, we're told, assume a similar number of women, then all the children and all the flocks and herds as well. They've just walked for 3 days out into the desert, and they've clearly drunk all the water that they brought with them. So verse 23, you can imagine their relief when they come to a water source, and then their disappointment when they find that they can't drink it, because it was bitter, is the word here, which is not talking about the fact they didn't like the flavour. There was something bad in the water. What now? What are they going to do? What should they do in the light of what they already know of God? What should they do? Well, it's not going to be that difficult, is it, for a God who has split the Red Sea? It's not going to be that difficult for a God to provide, even for all these people, the God who made the heavens and the earth. What they actually do is verse 24, they grumble against Moses. What they should do is what Moses does in verse 25. He cries out to the Lord. Instead of grumbling against the leadership, they should have prayed. They should have said, Lord, as a whole community, Lord, you've brought us here. You've made us promises. We trust you. We don't know how, but we trust you that you can provide for us. Please, would you? Because actually what God does next is he does provide for them. Actually, he does it in a way that involves Moses, so that Moses is kind of, again, reinforced as the person that God has chosen to lead them. And he provides for them water, as Moses is used to sweeten the water so that they can drink it. And what's really interesting is what God says next in the second half of verse 25. The Lord has issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test, it says. Isn't that interesting? God tested them. They faced challenges like this one. They shouldn't have said, oh no, God's lost control, what are we going to do? because they should already have experienced, because they experienced it at the Red Sea back in chapter 14, that God is going to challenge them as a people. He's going to take them into hard times, but none of those are going to catch him by surprise. None of those are going to catch him out. He's going to allow them to be tested so that they would discover repeatedly over and over that he has a plan, he will care for them, he will provide. My guess is that most of us don't particularly like tests. If you are still doing them because of that's where you're at in education, or if you're thinking, oh, phew, I haven't had to do a test for years, most of us, it's relief. But usually tests they're not our favourite thing, but they're designed to do something positive normally. Imagine, for example, a rising tennis star like Coco Gauff, who will, I'm sure, do well at Wimbledon next week. But imagine her as a young girl. She is still a young girl, isn't she? But I know 10 years ago, she shows so much promise with a tennis racket. Clearly talented, but if she just spent all her day with a wall, find a wall somewhere and hit the ball against the wall with her racket and do it really well, but that's all she did, then she wouldn't be playing at Wimbledon next week, would she? She wouldn't have improved. What she needed and has obviously received was training. She needs matches, training to push her past the point that she thinks she's able to go to, matches against people who are better than her, people who will beat her in the short term, so that she can learn, so that she can grow, so that she can improve. And as she experiences those tests over the last decade and more probably for her, that's how she's got to be so good today. In that sort of a way, our faith in God will need to be tested in order to develop, in order to grow. The muscles of our faith, if you like, they're naturally quite weak. If they're not exercised, they won't grow. And so that's what God does for us. Like a tennis coach or any other sports coach, he leads us through tests in life in order to develop our faith. And if you look down to verse 26, it's not just the obvious challenges like the Israelites were obviously going through here. Actually, God says he's going to give them an everyday test of whether they will trust him enough to live by what he says. Verse 26 it repeats the same idea twice. Listen carefully to the Lord your God, and so do what is right in his eyes. Pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees. It's emphasized, isn't it? Listen to God first, but don't just listen with your ears and go, oh, that was interesting. Listen and receive it and take it to heart and then live it out. That's the daily test that the Israelites faced and that you and I do too. And God promises, do you see what God promises the Israelites? If they do that, I won't bring on them any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, he says. And you think, oh, great. Great, and hang on a minute. What do you mean? Why do they need that promise? I mean, that's good not to have any of those diseases that the Egyptians... But why on earth do the Israelites need him to promise that? Because hasn't he chosen them? Aren't they his people? Doesn't he love them? Yes, to all of those questions. But he hasn't chosen them because they're more deserving than the Egyptians, as they repeatedly demonstrate. And actually, if you flash forward, if you know this verse, Romans chapter 6, verse 23, to the New Testament, what does the whole human race deserve? Everyone who sins, the wages of sin is death, is what it says. So it's not something inherent in the Israelites. It's not their future potential that means that God has chosen them and is interested in them and is rescuing them. No, it's just because he has. That's why they're special. That's why they're chosen, because God has chosen them. And he wants them to discover that ordinary, sinful, rebellious, grumbling as they are, he is the Lord who heals. He wants them and us to experience that. Now, he's also the judge of the whole earth, which is what the Egyptians have experienced. They've had their pride crushed, their nation humbled by God. They've received what sin deserves. And he's desperate that Israel won't have to go through that too. They don't need to. They've already seen it in Egypt. They've seen the reality that God takes sin seriously. He wants the Israelites to walk in health, to walk in righteousness, to walk in good relationship with him always, to discover the goodness and the healthiness of his way of life in their lived experience, in ours too, to say yes to what he says yes to and no to what he says no to. So these tests and trials, they have this dual purpose: to develop Israel's faith and at the same time to reveal God's good character. He doesn't want to have to rebuke them or discipline them or punish them. They've seen what he's done in Egypt. He doesn't want to do it again, and he shouldn't need to. If only they will now trust him and walk in his ways, they will discover his goodness and his provision. Like at Marah, this place where the water was bitter, it was a test, and then God provided, and the water became sweet. And if you look down to verse 27, where he leads them next, he provides again. They go to Elim, where there is a plentiful water supply, and then they have a period of rest, it seems. Because the next verse, verse 1 of chapter 16, describes the 15th day of the second month after they've come out of Egypt. It's about 6 weeks since the crossing of the Red Sea. So they've had a time of rest, camping at Elim, experiencing God the healer, providing for his people. And then the rest of chapter 16 is the next test. And what do we discover about the Israelites? They've still got lots to learn. As they go out into the desert again, it's food they run out of this time. What should they have done? Exactly. What do they do? Verse 2. Same again. Grumbled against their leaders, Moses and Aaron. At least that's what they think. That's all they think they're doing. They're grumbling away at Moses and Aaron is what they think they're doing. But if you flip the page to verse 7, Moses says, actually, they're grumbling against God. That's why grumbling's a spiritual issue. It's almost always questioning whether God is good, questioning whether he cares, questioning whether he's able to make any difference at all. And look at what the Israelites are saying in verse 3. Basically, they're saying, we were better off in Egypt. Seriously? Have you got such a short memory? It was miserable in Egypt. They were slaves. But all they can think about was, well, at least we had food there. They're all nostalgic. Wasn't it wonderful, all that food we had? And if we're tempted to look down on them, which I guess we might be, and think, oh, they should have done better than that, then I just want to say I'm quite a lot like that sometimes. I've got such a short memory of God's goodness. Especially those of us who've been Christians for a while. I think we just forget, how good God is, how kind he's been to us over the years, what he's done for us in the past. We forget what it was like to live without knowing Jesus, without having any assurance of sins forgiven or the love of God in our lives, the presence, the help of the Holy Spirit. We just forget, and we begin to get nostalgic for a non-Christian life, for Egypt, if you like. Or if we became Christians as children, just to imagine, how my life would have been if I hadn't become a Christian. If only I hadn't grown up in a Christian family, says the teenager, I would have played the field and had lots of fun. If only I hadn't become a Christian, thinks the single girl, I'd have married that really good-looking millionaire, and now look at me, I'm 28. I'm on my own, and all the decent Christian blokes are already married. If I hadn't become a Christian, says the student, I'd have been having a whale of a time at all the parties. What have I got instead? Non-alcoholic mocktails and helping out with the youth group on Friday nights. If I hadn't followed you, God, I'd be so much happier. Which of us in this room has not felt that or said that at some time or another? It's a drastic failure of memory and of understanding. To understand how enormous it is for God to forgive our sins, to have us back. The thing we sang at the beginning, he split the sea. Actually, he split his son so we could walk back home to him. That's how we're forgiven. That it is universe-sized enormousness. I know those words aren't right, they're not in my notes, but I'm trying to convey the extraordinary reality of what God has done for us, the greatness of his love for us. And we easily forget it. Our hearts go to Egypt. We start to moan just like the Israelites. And we wouldn't really blame God if he lost patience with them, would we? Or with us. But look at who he is. Look how he responds. Verse 4, once again, they grumble. He's gracious. He provides bread from heaven. He's the Lord who heals. Although again, if you notice in verse 4, the provision comes with a test. God gives them daily bread, manna, but they must exercise daily faith. He provides just enough for each day, for 2 days. None of it's to be stored up, except on the 6th day, because there's going to be none on the 7th, so they can have a rest and learn that about God. And again, he's revealing his character through all this. Look at verse 11, what he says. The Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. And so God provided meat and manna, bread from heaven, for his people in the wilderness. Such a clear demonstration that God is a loving God. God is a providing God. He is the God who meets all our needs. He is the God who heals us. But the Israelites, again, didn't learn the lesson. If it was a test, the manner and how they would respond, they failed it. They've been told, don't store any overnight. If you read on just a bit beyond where we were, verse 20, some of them didn't pay any attention. They hoarded it. And the next morning, it was full of maggots and had begun to smell. They've been told, don't go out on the 7th day. There won't be any. Sure enough, a whole lot of them go out on the 7th day, just as they'd done before, thinking, where's the manna? Verse 27, nevertheless, some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather it, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? It's not unreasonable, is it? God has been really clear. He's provided for them. And yet they just follow their instincts and don't listen to what he says. You see, to get Israelites out of Egypt, in the end, it just took a day for them to be released and then through the sea and then into the desert and then free. But to get Egypt out of their systems, that's going to take a long, long time. And it's the same for us. They were unbelievers by nature, Egyptian. We're unbelievers by nature. And that's why God leads you and me and us as a church through tests as well. That actually he wants us to, as we go through the journey of this life, this world, to learn not to be worldly, not to just blend in and join in, and rather to be people who, because of his word, trust his promises and head in his direction and trust his judgment on how to do life well and trust his provision even when we can't see past the next day or week. That's God's call to us, to you and me. Jesus said, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Instead, we're to pray, as we did earlier on, give us today our daily bread, and leave tomorrow and tomorrow's bread in God's hands. After all, God has already provided for our greatest need, hasn't he? By giving his own son, Jesus, by his sacrifice being the way back. And that's paid in full. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. That's the picture he used of him, one of the pictures he used of himself. He talked about us feeding on him, which, as we put our faith in Jesus, is what we do spiritually. We feed on him in our souls. We benefit from him, just as if we'd eaten him. And he heals us. He restores us. He makes us back into his image through the years as we trust him and feed on him. And so, in the words of Romans 6, verse 8, if God did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? You see? Our daily bread. And as for grumbling, we said at the beginning that one of the reasons we do it is to let frustration out. And we need to do that somehow, don't we? It's not good to bottle it all up. And it's not Bible faith to bottle it all up. Moses' example here is he cries out to the Lord in prayer. And that's the difference. So we go through life not grumbling at God or at life or at circumstances or the hand we've been dealt, all of which is indirectly grumbling against God as well. We don't grumble against God, we go to God with who we are, with what we're feeling, with what we're going through. And if you want an example of how to do that, there's plenty of them in the book of Psalms, example after example. They're really honest, some of them. They complain, they cry out with kind of raw, brutal honesty. At the same time with faith in the God who heals. Sometimes clinging on by your fingernails type faith, sometimes tiny as a mustard seed type faith. But still faith in the God who somehow, in spite of it all, provides, who somehow, in spite of it all, is with us in the midst of it. So that's the vision. Instead of grumbling to whoever is listening, going to the God who is always listening, the God who heals, the God who provides for his people.